This is our second research seminar, Friday ecology seminar for this semester. And I invited Mac Callaham, who is a really great scientist, but also a really good friend of mine. I think when I interviewed for this job and I was in the car with Sharon Billings going to the field station, she asked if I knew Mac Callaham. And I said, yeah, he's my best friend. And I felt kind of insecure about that statement ever since I said it. It repeats in my mind. But anyway, good friend, great ecologist. Mac has an interesting history. He has a bachelor's of science in zoology and double majored, also has a bachelor of arts in English. And you'll probably notice that when he gives his presentation today. And a master's of science in agronomy. All three of those degrees he received from the University of Georgia, where I met Mac, and during my master's program. And then he went to Kansas State University to work with John Blair, another great soil ecologist, did his PhD there in biology and finished in 2000. After that, he did a postdoc at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And ever since then, he has been working for the USDA Forest Service in Athens, Georgia, where he is a team leader and research ecologist at the Southern Research Station and is part of the Center for Forest Disturbance Science. He is, in my very humble opinion, a world expert authority on earthworms, their ecology and their biogeography. He's broadly interested in soil ecosystem response to disturbance, which we're going to hear about today, particularly soil fauna, how they're affected by land management, and also the effects of land management on elemental cycling and organic matter dynamics. I invited Mac here today because I think his research is going to appeal broadly to this audience, but also he's a really good example of a PhD level career outside of academia that is focused on research and ecological research. So Mac, do you want to share your screen?
I will do that.
Yeah. So I did my PhD at Kansas State University, where with Mac during that time, and I spent most days hearing about the importance of earthworms. Which I don't know how much he's going to focus on that today. Seminar today is brought to you by the letters F and L on the topic of the forest floor, leaf litter as fuel, food, and fulcrum for tipping points in eastern forests. So Mac, with that, take it away.
SB, that was a great introduction. It sounds way better than my actual life, so maybe I need to get some more coaching from you on various aspects of that. So first, just let me say thanks to Sara and for the rest of the department there, and in particular the graduate students. I look forward to maybe talking to you guys a little bit about this extra academic career that I've managed to put together if there's time when this is all over. I'm going to talk a lot today about work that my graduate students and graduate students associated with our group here in Athens have done. So I understand very well how important the work of graduate students is, and so I'd be interested to be able to mix it up with you guys a little bit at the end if there's time. So as Sara said, I'm with the US Forest Service. The name of our center has actually changed. We are now calling ourselves the Athens Prescribed Fire Lab, and this represents a change or a shift in research priority. I'm sure all of you are aware of the fire issues that face the nation's national forests. And so we've been doing as much work as we can to try to understand what leads to those fires, what the effects of those fires are, how we can better model their behavior and spread, occurrence, how we can model the incidence of smoke and where that smoke ends up, and various other aspects of fire ecology. So you'll probably detect as I give the talk that I have been gradually shifting my focus away from worms. Sadly, I know this is a very sad piece of news for some of you, but you'll also see, I hope, that I've managed to weave that thread through the fabric of my career, and hopefully that'll be evident by the time it's over. So just to give a little background, I know Sarah's kind of alluded to some of this already, but I have worked through my career on invasive earthworms and other invertebrates, not only invasive earthworms, but also native earthworms. And I could talk all day about the difference between native and invasive earthworms, but I'll spare you that. And we'll just try to focus on how these are relevant to the topic today. And more broadly, and in this group that I'm in now with the Forest Service, we've spent a lot of time examining the influence and the effect of fire presence and absence in forests of the East. And more recently, we've thought quite a bit about this concept of misification of the eastern forests. And if you're not familiar with that concept, I'll go into some more detail. But so I've been thinking about these things for 20, 25 years now. And as Sarah knows, I have this penchant for drawing conceptual models to try and help me understand the systems that I'm examining, and to try to help me explain to other people how these concepts relate to one another. And so I found that as I was going through the years, each one of these independent topics have generated conceptual models, and each one of these conceptual models has featured the forest floor, or the organic horizons of soil, as something that's critical to all of the observed phenomena. And so hence the title of the talk. So first, I think we should get a little bit familiarity with the forest floor, or these litter and duff horizons. So foresters and people who work for the Forest Service, and importantly, people who work in the fire side of the Forest Service, speak of the forest floor in terms of litter and duff. And these are different kinds of fuel. They have different characteristics in terms of the way they dry and the way they burn, and in terms of their effects after they're consumed in fires. So you'll probably hear me, since I've had chronic exposure to the Forest Service, you'll probably hear me use the term duff more often than not. But if you want to talk about it in relation to, say, for example, USDA soil taxonomy, the forest floor horizons, or the surface soil horizons in forested soils, are spoken of in terms of these letter designations. So the OI is new litter, OE is partially decomposed material that you can still recognize as being plant litter, and OA is the highly decomposed material that really no longer represents anything that's referable to a living plant. And all of those are usually on the surface of the mineral soil horizons, depending on a lot of factors, like what kind of vegetation it is, what kind of soil fauna are present, and so on. Some of you may be familiar with the European system of taxonomy. So those layers are referred to as L, F, and H, where L is litter, F is the fermentation layer, and H is the humus layer. All right, so that's just a little bit of orientation. So just for Sarah, I decided I would throw in quite a bit of information about earthworms in this talk, and I hope you'll see again that it all ties together in the end. So we want to talk about invasive earthworms, and again, this is a very broad brush, kind of 50,000 foot view of invasive earthworms, but I hope that many of you are aware that the forests of North America are in fact currently being invaded by a suite of European and African and Asian earthworms. And so the general effect of this invasion particularly in places where there is a thick layer of organic material perched on the mineral horizons, such as you can see here in this picture on the left. So if you look, there's the mineral soil surface, and then there's several centimeters of this partially decomposed or mostly decomposed plant material. So that would be your H layer there, and then the F layer here, and then the litter layer here. So once these worms invade, they churn through this organic material. It's like an all-you-can-eat smorgasbord for these worms. And so they end up just mixing this material in with the mineral soil. And really what you're left with is a completely different kind of profile, where only last year's leaf litter remains as a distinct entity, and then everything else is just kind of mixed into this surface horizon of mineral soil. And so what it looks like from above ground, so this is kind of a sagittal view here, what it looks like from above ground is you get this collapse of that duff layer, the spongy, partially decomposed material. Once it's not there, what you have left is space. And you can see clearly the roots of this tree, where they used to be covered by duff and stained by organic material and so forth, are now exposed to the elements and to the free air, and this has significant consequences for overall forest health. If you're interested in reading more about this system, I recommend you to the works of Lee Freilich, who's at University of Minnesota. He's done a tremendous amount of work on invasive species in the northern forests. So we also have invasive species in the Southeast, and so a guy who was a student at UGA at the time, back in the early 2000 teens, Bruce Snyder and I, and along with Paul Hendricks and some other folks, put together several experiments where we were looking at these Asian earthworms. They're the so-called jumping worms. And because Bruce was a millipede enthusiast, we wanted to see whether or not the invasion of these worms was going to have any consequences for millipedes, because the Southern Appalachian Mountains are a major biodiversity hotspot for millipedes. And we know that millipedes eat leaf litter. We know that these worms also eat leaf litter. So we set up some competition experiments in these arenas like this. You can see there's a large millipede there. We incubated these with different kinds of litter material, with worms and without worms. And sure enough, it turns out that if you incubate millipedes with earthworms, the invasive earthworms, they compete for food. The litter disappears completely inside the arenas, and the millipedes die much sooner than they do if they're just left alone. So an average of 200 days or so when they're left alone in FH material, and then they die after only a couple of months if you incubate them with worms. And there were some complications involving the food source as well. So, but the bottom line, take home message, worms are bad for earthworms. Worms are bad for millipedes. Okay, so then I had a postdoc named Hiroshi Ikeda, and this is going back about 6-7 years now. Hiroshi Ikeda came and was interested in studying the system of Asian earthworms. The earthworms in question are Japanese in origin. And so he had done some work with them back home in Japan and wanted to study the invasion system here. And so we started thinking about ways that these earthworms might be controlled, given that we know now that they have negative impacts on native biodiversity pools and other biogeochemical consequences as well, including this consumption of leaf litter, mineralization of nutrients, and all kinds of things like this. So we started scratching our heads, and it seemed like the most direct way to get at these worms is to remove their food source, and or possibly cause some direct mortality by using prescribed fire. And so that we did a little study, and this is published in Soil Biology and Biochemistry. And so I just draw your attention down to the panels and images. So we set up these test beds, put the worms in there, let them do their thing for 6 weeks or so, and then we set the leaf litter layer that we created in the test beds on fire. And we went back after the fires were over and sampled for adult worms. And you can see that on the burn side, we had fewer worms, but it was not statistically significant. But we had a few incidences of being able to actually see the dead worms on the surface of the soil. It seems cruel, but they are invasive species, so we didn't feel too bad. But so we got some direct mortality, but of even greater interest to us was that when we collected cocoons, these are the reproductive propagules of the species, we collected those from unburned and burned test beds, and then incubated them to see if they would hatch. It turns out that exposing those cocoons to a little bit of heat from a prescribed fire, the temperatures were not extremely high, right? Particularly for things that are buried a centimeter or two in the mineral soil. But just a little bit of exposure to heat was enough to render these cocoons inviable, right? So we're only getting about 1 out of every 3 hatching, as opposed to 8 out of 10 hatching if they're not exposed to this kind of heat. So we started to think, okay, well, maybe this prescribed fire thing is an idea that has some legs and needs to be tested in the field. All right, and then the most recent development in the invasive earthworm arena is that this guy, who you can see, apparently he's very skilled at turning away from the camera when I'm holding it. This guy is Tim McKay. He's at Colgate University, and he's up here again. You can see the side of his head here too. Tim McKay and his colleague down at Mahue put together this workshop on jumping worms, the biology and ecology of these invasive pheretomoid earthworms. And they invited pretty much everybody who had published a paper on these worms in the past 20 years to the campus at Colgate, and we all got together and talked about what can be done. And I'll refer you to this paper that just came out in Biological Invasions last year. And you see that conceptual diagram? That was my contribution to the paper. And so I'll just point out to you that when we came down to examining all of the effects that these pheretomoid earthworms have, both above ground and below ground, in terms of physical, chemical, and biological effects on soil and above ground systems, all of it feeds out of this area that is the forest floor, right? So I'm thinking again, the forest floor really is a nexus of activity for understanding the effects of earthworms, and as I showed you earlier, fire, right? Or maybe, no, I didn't show you that yet. I'm going to show you that now. Okay, so maybe you're asking the question, why did it even occur to you guys to use fire to try to control these earthworms, right? And so now I'm going to move into a second part of the talk where I want to focus more on our studies involving fire. Okay, so why fire? Why would that even occur to us? I hope that since you are all in Kansas and you live in a fire-prone ecosystem and landscape, that I don't need to convince you that fire has been a really important factor in shaping ecosystems across the continent for a really long time. We know from long study that fire influences vegetation, can influence elemental dynamics, has interactions with climate, and I think most importantly, perhaps in the Southeast, has a really long human history as well. And so I'll just go through a few lines of evidence to try and help back up these statements. So you look at this great plot from this paper by Rich Guyette and his colleagues at University of Missouri, just down the road from you guys. Came out in 2012. This plot basically shows the capacity of the ecosystem in question using a model that takes into account the climate, the actual structure of the vegetation, the chemistry of the vegetation as variables. And it just predicts how often that ecosystem could burn based on that suite of characteristics. And so you can see that there is huge portions of almost the entirety of peninsular Florida and most of the upper coastal plain and the Piedmont in the southeastern states, including Texas, and then up into the areas where you guys are. This vegetation can support ignition and propagate fire on the average of every 2 years or so, or less even. Parts of Florida even less than every 2 years. And so that seems like a pretty strong line of evidence that, first of all, fire can happen very frequently, and second of all, that the vegetation is in fact adapted to that phenomenon. So right now we're focusing in this area. We'll go from, the rest of the talk will go from up here down to here or so. And so we're spanning an area of geography that is at least capable of burning very frequently. So then I'll turn your attention to the palynological work of Ballard et al., which is based on the very famous work by the Delcourts. I don't know if people who work mainly in grassland, I don't know if most of you work in grasslands or not, but if you've come up in any kind of forest ecology tradition, you have seen the work of the Delcourts, which is basically a pollen record that goes back 20 something thousand years. And it's based on cores that they took from Anderson Pond in or central Tennessee. And so the important thing that happened after the Delcourts got their pollen records published in several different formats, Ballard and others came back and looked at those slides that were prepared by the Delcourts and evaluated them for charcoal presence. And so if you look on this axis, this is time going back to 23,000 years. So you can see very clearly around 15,000 years ago or so, that's when the glaciers, the last Pleistocene glaciers, started to retreat. And we saw a wholesale change in the pollen record and therefore ostensibly the vegetation present in that part of the world, right? And so things were tripping merrily along for a few thousand years. And then around 8,000 years ago, there turns out to be a tremendous amount of charcoal turn up in the record. And so the Ballard and colleagues paper opines that this is due mainly to changes in climate, because this is the mean Holocene warming period here, or mid-Holocene warming period. And they say that this incidence of charcoal is coincident with this warming period. But I would also argue with you that this is coincident with the advent of human culture in that part of the world. And we think that human use of fire and human-derived ignitions have been a really important source of both fire and charcoal in the record. And so to further that line of reasoning, I just want to bring to your attention this really great story from the early history of the Carolina, the early English history of the Carolinas. This guy named John Lawson was one of the earliest explorers in that area, and it's his travels are detailed in this great book by Scott Hewler. If you have free time, I suggest you read it. But in this, or if you care about the Carolinas at all, I suggest you read it. We know that Charleston was founded in the late 1600s. Lawson began his trek across the interior of the Carolinas, which were untouched by European settlers at that time. And so they were traveling along, it says traveled about 20 miles, lying near a savanna that was overflowing with water, but we were very short of victuals. So there's two really important things here. One is that they just left without enough food. And two is that when they knew that they were going to be close to the Indian settlements, they were going to be relieved of their issues about food. The Indians would share food with them everywhere they went. And I think the book is, and Lawson's notes are most important for the observations that he made about the native peoples of the Carolinas. But I think that it's also an interesting statement here that we found the woods newly burnt and on fire in many places, which gave us great hope that Indians were not far off. So this suggests that at least 300 years ago, the natives were using fire for various purposes and routinely, such that smoke was a way to know that they were nearby, right? So human beings have been using fire on this landscape for a long time. And this cultural tradition of burning the woods in the Southeast has really persisted and has kind of been transmitted into the European culture as well, the colonizers' culture. And so you can see this when we look at just a comparison of acres burned on the left. This is acres burned by wildfires by state, and compare it to the number of acres burned in prescribed fires on the right. And this is in thousands. So 1,000 is at least 1 million acres, right? So California and Nevada burn 1 million acres accidentally every year, or in 2018, whereas Georgia, Alabama, and Florida each burned 1 million acres on purpose in 2018. So I think that looking at how much land gets burned on purpose and comparing it to how much land burns by accident in those places, I think there's a correlation, right? If you are using fires to manage your fuels and manage your forests, they're a lot less susceptible to wildfire. And I know it's much more complicated than that, but I just want to point these things out. Okay, so nevertheless, this guy, Smokey Bear, in his ad council wonder, managed to convince everybody on the continent for 100 years or more that the default position on fire ought to be that if you see one, you should put it out, right? And so this has kind of resulted in an overall policy of, and I'm not talking about just USDA here, I'm talking about a general policy of human beings living on the continent. If you see a fire, you should put it out. And so what that has resulted in is unnatural accumulations of organic matter on the soil surface in a lot of places that haven't seen enough fire. So here's another one of my patented conceptual diagrams here. I can see Sara trying not to laugh right now. So if we want to talk about longleaf pine ecosystems, which are probably the best known forest ecosystems maintained by frequent fire, and you look at, I've got these two boxes on the left, which are to represent fire suppressed, the fire suppressed situation, and compare them on the right to the fire maintained situation. What you notice is that in the fire suppressed situation, you get a buildup of this material called duff, which is humus and the fermentation layer. It's full of nutrients, and it ends up being a location for the proliferation of miles of fine roots, right? And so what happens when this material catches on fire, which it almost inevitably does, is that when that stuff gets consumed in a fire, all these fine roots are left high and dry, or worse, they're consumed themselves in the fire. And that is a significant physiological hit to the overstory trees when a situation like this happens, a wildfire in a fire suppressed system. On the other hand, if you get a fire maintained system where fire has been occurring frequently, the duff never has a chance to build up because there's not enough organic material to decompose into it. You wind up with not very much fine root length at all in that material. And when it burns with less intensity. The only fuel is this material at the surface, the litter. And so you get no physiological hit to the adult trees after a wildfire. Does that all make sense? I can only see Sara, so I'm looking for somebody to nod. Maybe I'll give a few more faces here. Oh, never mind. Okay, so it's fine that, you know, this is all fine. I made a little cartoon, but let's take it to the field and see what the reality is. So we've got the Forest Service maintains a network of experimental forests. And in the Southern Research Station, we have 19 of them. One of them is in Florida near the little town of Olustee. And it's called Olustee Experimental Forest. It's part of the Osceola National Forest. Northeast Florida, kind of between Lake City and Jacksonville. And so at this experimental forest, we've got a long-term fire frequency study that's been going since 1958, so 64 year in its 64th year now. So I'm not positive of this, but I think it could be advertised as the longest running fire experiment on Earth. And we're pretty proud of it. So it's laid out in a completely randomized block design with the blocks going from north to south based on a moisture gradient. And then within those blocks, each block has 4 treatments where the block, which is about a hectare in size, each block is about a hectare in size, has been burned annually, every 2 years, every 4 years, or left unburned since 1958. Okay, so what does that mean? We did some sampling. This is going way back, maybe 15 years ago, to measure standing stocks of carbon in these different fire frequencies. And so what you can see, what I have depicted here are A horizon, E horizon, B horizon. Those are all mineral soil horizons. And then the organic horizons are the top ones, OA, OE, and OI. And so what you can see is that in the reference situation, you do get tremendous accumulations of that OE and OA material. Intermediate amounts in the 4-year frequency and almost none in the 1-year frequency. There's some there, but it's so small you can't even see the bar. Okay, and so this is great. When we look at this, we're talking about overall carbon standing stocks, carbon storage in these systems. It looks like that reference situation is not that bad in terms of carbon storage, right? Looks like the 4-year plot is not that bad in terms of carbon storage. But what happens when you get that fire? So we're calling this pool a fire labile pool. It's combustible material. So if you draw a reference line across what could be lost, now you realize that the frequent fire intervals actually store more fire protected carbon in these soils. I think that's a pretty big deal and not a story that people are hearing very much when it comes to fire management of ecosystems. So we sat on this data for a long time, and then we were blessed with a student, PhD student named Dexter Strother. And he just finished his PhD and is going to become a permanent member of our unit, which is really fantastic. And so Dexter, for his dissertation work, initiated a series of more detailed studies, and he had a focus on char and black carbon formation. But in the interest of time today, we don't really have time to talk about this. I'm just going to give a brief overview. So here's a stylized carbon cycle. Everybody in the room, quote unquote, should be familiar with these kinds of models where you look at CO2 going into live plant material, which goes into dead plant material, which goes into soil organic matter, and so on, right? The interesting thing in this system is that we've got the occurrence of fire, which returns CO2 to the atmosphere, but part of it also turns into BC, which is represented by this box here in the soil organic matter. So Dexter focused in on this part of the cycle. And here's another little drawing of that. And so just to remind you, these are real fires and real ecosystems and real plants, real pools of vegetation that we're talking about. So the picture on the left is kind of trying to show you what we're really after. And so we're going to focus even more for the purposes of this talk on this box called dead fuel, which is that litter and duff, right? And so just one little high point in terms of data from Dexter stuff. We measured the mass of duff, that OE-OA horizon, that OLUSTI, relative to those fire frequency, different fire frequencies. And it turns out that if you leave it unburned for 60 years, you get 3 times the amount of duff accumulation as you do in 1 and 2 year plots, with 4 being intermediate, but trending very closely to the more frequently burned plots, right? So maybe this isn't rocket science, maybe it's not a big surprise, but it's just another answer to the question, what does fire do to duff, which I think could have been the title of this talk as well. All right, so to conclude for the longleaf portion, which is just one of the many fire dominated ecosystems in the Southeast, fire influences soil carbon, no big surprise there. Interactions between fuel loading, and this really is the meat of Dexter's dissertation and ongoing work in those plots. Interactions between fuel loading, fire behavior, vegetation composition, all those things influence the formation and or retention, and I would argue chemical nature of the remaining duff. And we have lots more work to do. And I know that's a cliche, but I feel like it has to be said. All right, so now let's move to another fire dependent forest ecosystem in the Southeast and talk about the work of Melanie Taylor, who's another fantastic graduate student that we have working with us in our group. She's probably halfway through her dissertation work now, working within the Odom School of Ecology at UGA and in Nina Wurzburger's lab in cooperation with us in our group with the Forest Service. So back in 2016, maybe you guys heard about this on the news. Large portions of the Southern Appalachian Mountains caught on fire because we were gripped in a severe drought. And this was maybe in November and December of 2016. So about 5 years ago, 5 years and change. And so we started asking questions again, the big question is, what does fire do to duff? And how much duff do we have formed in these systems that have been fire suppressed for at least 100 years? And so we tried to couch it in terms or frame it in terms of this larger overarching theoretical approach to eastern forests, which is the idea of misification. So I hope you've heard about misification in eastern forests. The idea is that we're undergoing a massive shift in species composition away from the fire tolerant species toward fire intolerant species, which have different biogeochemical relationships and all kinds of things. So the question is, why is this transition happening? And the work, the seminal work of Greg Nowacki and Mark Abrams in 2008 in bioscience, they suggested that fire exclusion was one of the main reasons we're seeing this transition from things like oaks and hickories into things like poplars and maples and these more mesophytic species. Okay, so what does that mean? So when we look at those different species relative to their biology and biogeochemistry, we see that the fire tolerant species, oaks and hickories, have more recalcitrant litter. They're ectomycorrhizal fungal associates. That litter decomposes more slowly relative to their counterparts. And importantly, pure stands of oaks and hickories result in large formations of duff over time when fire is excluded. On the other hand, fire intolerant species like your acer and liriodendron species, their litter is much more labile. In other words, it decomposes more quickly. Their fungal associates are arbuscular. Their litter decomposes rapidly, and these forests are characterized by zero duff accumulation, partly because their litter decomposes so rapidly and so completely that there's nothing left over for duff to form. So we've got this mosaic already happening on the landscape in the Southern Appalachians. What happens when you set it on fire? So we'll go back to this. I've now repurposed my old hobby horse here for Appalachian forests now. And if you look at ECM trees, it's an interesting juxtaposition to the longleaf pine system, right? So your ECM trees have large formations of duff. That duff has large proliferation of fine roots in it. And when it sets on fire, which we would argue is inevitable at some point, those fine roots, again, left high and dry, they get burned up, and it's bad for the overstory trees. On the other hand, poplar and maple in a fire suppressed situation, no duff or little duff. When you get a wildfire, no big deal. This is a little bit counterintuitive that the fire intolerant species are actually less impacted by fires when they occur. So again, this is all well and good when you're doing it in a theoretical context, but let's take it to the field and see what happens. So in 2016, the Rock Mountain Fire, which is depicted by this blob over here on the left, occurred in a place called Tate City, Georgia, which is due north of Athens, about 60, 70 miles. We established plots inside and outside the burned area. And you can see these represented by stars here. And we tried to measure various things that would be pertinent to our questions. And importantly, these plots were arrayed along a gradient of ECM basal area. So we had plots that were, less than 30% oak or ECM basal area all the way up to 100%. To try and test some of the ideas that were put forth in that previous conceptual model. So the fire didn't really look like much, right? This is what a great majority of that fire looked like. The flame heights are less than a foot, and it just kind of creeped its way down through. But when it caught duff on fire, because the duff was very dry, it ended up being really a fairly severe, highly severe event relative to fuel consumption. And so here are some pictures to demonstrate that. So you can see that on this picture on the left, can you guys see the cursor when I'm pointing? Good, because I'm doing a lot of it. So you can see that the duff actually had been up at this level on that tree, and it consumed it all the way down. That's several centimeters worth of duff. And, that's a pretty significant effect. And so if we walked out, this is actually not the Rock Mountain Fire, but a fire that happened in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. You can see up here, you can see that similar collar that sort of demarcates where the duff actually used to be, and now it's all been consumed. So again, a fairly significant effect. Okay, that's fine. So then we measured it, which is what you should do, I guess, if you want to make claims about something. So this is a paper from Dana Carpenter, who some of you probably know. And this is a paper that she produced as part of her master's degree, which she did with Nina Wurzberger. So what does duff do to fire? Again, maybe not the most earth-shattering result in the world, but when you burn it, it goes away. What are you trying to indicate, Sarah? Running out of time? Okay, I don't know how much time I have left, sorry. Very few minutes. Okay, so what does fire do to duff? It makes it go away. What does fire do to tree canopy? Now, this is a question because the fire didn't result in immediate mortality. The mortality was induced as a result of the consumption of fine roots and a physiological hit, not necessarily a mortal blow dealt by the fire itself. So we had to measure this for years after. So in 2019, if you look at that ECM gradient, right? So we're out here, the 100% ECM is all oaks. And over here is no, whoops, oh my gosh. Over here is no oaks. So if you look at the probability that there was crown decline, that probability probability of crown decline, this is crown class here is being depicted here. The decreasing slope here indicates decline in the quality of the canopy in those stands. So 3 years afterwards, we're detecting major impacts to the canopy of those trees, and it's in the oaks. Again, counterintuitive. These are trees that are supposed to be fire adapted, and they're having the most negative response to the fire. Okay, so what about macroinvertebrates? We also sampled invertebrates in these plots. There's a picture of a worm right there. We looked at worms and all these other things. By digging soil pits and sorting the material out, and we're just now getting to the phase of being able to actually analyze these data, but we have run some multivariate stats on the collections, and we realize that there are significant effects of the fire, the season in which those collections were made, and the ECM tree abundance on this kind of in-dimensional space represented by the plot of the total invertebrate community. And so for the litter invertebrate, we did both for litter and for the mineral soil. And you can see that in this plot for the litter invertebrates, it seems like the fire effect was greater. There are communities associated with burned and unburned plots of litter, say, for example. And then if we looked at the soil invertebrates, this was much more clearly impacted by the ECM status of the overstory trees. And so what you can see in this plot is that these lighter symbols are representative of those lower ECM class trees. So these are Liriodendron and Acer type soils, and they have their own associated faunal community. So we got a lot more work to do on these too. That's probably the last point in my conclusions for the Rock Mountain fire. So again, kind of counterintuitively, tree mortality and canopy decline were predicted by species identity, with ECM trees being much more susceptible than AM trees. There are feedbacks in the soil biotic community with response to fire, and we got more work to do, of course. So anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say, except a few more final thoughts with a view of what worms and fire do to duff, right? So you remember this picture about the worms and this picture about the fire? If you're like me, you can't help but notice that those are kind of similar in appearance, right? They look almost identical to one another in terms of what happened to that forest floor. And so if you're like me, you're starting to get a tingling feeling, right? You're starting to get excited. Hopefully you feel like this whole thing is building to a crescendo. And so we've kind of tried to really get a new conceptual model that talks about the fuel fulcrum or the food fulcrum with respect to these duff layers, organic horizons, as influenced either by fungal communities, fire exclusion or fire presence, fire inclusion, earthworms, and so on, right? And so we see this fulcrum, the fuel, as being a tipping point or a fulcrum upon which these ecosystems are tipping between the xeric communities, which are oaks and hickories, and the mesophytic communities, which are maples and poplars. So if you look at a frequent fire forest, the fulcrum is pushed in this direction by ECM fungi, frequent fire, endogeeic earthworms, if any. We can talk more about endogeeic and epigeeic worms. Didn't have time for this talk. But The fulcrum in this case is defined as having higher litter quantity with slow decomposability, moderate organic horizon depth, really high flammability, and frequent fire occurrence, right? And so this tips the balance in favor of xeric forests. On the other hand, if you have AM fungi pushing the fulcrum in this direction, fire exclusion, epigeic earthworms, which are eating all of that organic material, you get the balance tipped in favor of mesophytic species, with the fulcrum being characterized or characterized as low quantity of litter, rapid decomposability, and all those other things that I've already talked about. So what's the point is that we currently have a transitioning forest, and we feel like to restore forests to their former fire resiliency, we have opportunities to manage some of these things, like the occurrence of fire, like the presence or absence of these epigeic non-native earthworms, which are consuming fuel and organic material. And so the opportunity exists for us to move the fulcrum in whichever direction we want based on our management objectives. But I would say that based on what most people feel is the natural state for those forests, we want to move it in the direction toward supporting the xeric forests. All right, I hope that made sense. I'm really, really grateful to my colleagues, Joe O'Brien and Nina Wurzberger and Louise Loudermilk, and others who work with me in the Athens Prescribed Fire Lab, along with a whole host of other people who really had blood, sweat, and tears in the data that have been shown to you today. So with that, I'll take any questions that you may have, and I have to show you this slide.
No, is that a requirement of your job?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Mac. Do you want to stop sharing so I can see if anyone has their hand
Sure.
up? Thank you. It was really great. Okay. Oh, those are clappy hands. Okay, so big round of applause. And then there are some raised hands. Helen Alexander.
Yeah, I just thought that was a great talk. I really appreciated that. Those are things I've heard about but don't know much about. I have two questions that are kind of at different ends of things. One is a more ecological question, and one is a more general question. The ecological question is, I'm curious, in those last slides where you had canopy death due to the fires, the oaks and things, did you have oak regeneration? Because in theory, the story line is that if you have more open canopy, you can get oak seedlings and saplings going. But I know a lot of those forests just don't have any oaks.
Yeah. So the issue there is whether or not there's any what foresters call advanced regen.
Right.
So you need to have present in the understory oak seedlings that are capable of filling gaps when there's crown decline, right? And so in this unfortunate case, most of those seedlings are rooted in the material that got consumed in the fires.
Mm-hmm.
So you lose the advanced regen. And so what we have seen a lot of is stump sprouting. So some of these species have the ability to produce these epicormic sprouts whenever they're top killed. And so the real end of the story is probably still 20 years away from us being able to tell. But yeah, so good questions. We don't have much evidence that there's advanced regen, and whether or not these epicormic sprouts are going to turn into a real oak forest or not is an open question.
And my general question is, so much of forest land is privately owned. And I'm just curious, with your job or others like that, how much encouragement are you getting in terms of private landowners using fire in management?
Yeah, that really depends on where you are. It's true that most of the forest land in the east is privately held. In the west, it's kind of the other way around. But yes, in the east, and so we do have within the Forest Service, we have a little known wing of a deputy area that's called State and Private Forestry. And so it exists as a conduit of information and funding for state and private forestry projects. And so they do have a very active, I don't know how, a charm offensive, I guess you would call it, underway, to try to promote private landowners to use prescribed fire. You know, there are so many other kind of legal issues and issues with dealing with air quality and air pollution and these kinds of things that really people just don't feel like they're expert enough to navigate. And I think that tends to dissuade people from trying to use prescribed fire, particularly in and I don't want to generalize or anything, but in the kind of the mid-Atlantic and New England states where fires really should be happening, it's just too much of a legal challenge or logistical challenge to do. But in the Southeast, I think it's a lot more accepted culturally, and as a result, more frequently applied.
Interesting. Thank you.
That's why Georgia, Florida, and Alabama have so many acres burned in prescribed fires every year.
Yeah. Bob?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've been interested in focus a little bit on the effect of deer on forest regeneration in our area with some exposure experiments. I wondered if how does browsing sort of interact with these other factors in terms of, particularly in terms of the regeneration questions?
Yeah. So the story, and I can only speak with any kind of intelligence at all about the situation in Georgia. So the story in Georgia is that the deer herd is significantly impacting regeneration of all hardwood species, but not in the mountain region, right? So for whatever reason, I guess maybe they were completely hunted out of the mountains back in the 50s, and they've just been really slow to recolonize those areas. Whereas in the Piedmont and coastal plain, the deer are extremely abundant, and they are a significant concern for regen of all hardwood species.
Does that interact with the fire regime in any way?
Yeah, you know, I don't think of the material that they're browsing at that level. I think if anything, it is helping to keep the fire regime as one of a surface fire regime, right? So they're removing any kind of ladder fuels that would promote the fire from getting into the canopy. So I don't know that there's been any real work done on that, but that's just kind of a gut reaction to the question. That they're cleaning out the understory and removing fuels that would otherwise make it possible for fires to get into the canopy. We don't have very many canopy fires in the Southeast, and almost never have prescribed fires get into the canopy. So it's generally a surface fire regime anyway. That's what we're trying to promote.
Mike? Sorry, I was muted.
Well, great talk. I really appreciate it. I will preface this by saying this is, first off, welcome. Thank you to everyone for welcoming a total outsider to this. I'm not an ecologist by any stretch of the imagination, but I found this.
Oh, I thought you were talking about me.
No, I'm more of the outsider, and I find it very fascinating thinking about fire. And this is probably way outside of what you do, but this gets me thinking back over geological time. I have to admit, I'm a paleontologist, so I'm thinking over larger timescales here, but particularly in relation to fire. And has anyone looked into the impact of resin accumulation in the litter and in the duff layer as a fuel contributing to it, because it's highly flammable, and so it can certainly contribute to the fire, but also the exudation of such plant resins as a result of, because plants will exude it from some sort of water stress. And of course, fire can be a great water stress as well, which then adds additional fuel to the whole phenomenon. And I'm just wondering has anyone explored the role of plant resins in any of this?
Wow. That is something that I know almost nothing about. So I have to apologize for my ignorance. I can speak from what I have observed in longleaf pine systems in particular. So longleaf pines are prodigious exuders of sap. And in fact, back in the turn of the century, they were used industrially as sources of resin for the naval stores industry and turpentine and all these other things. So yes, resin is very flammable. And in fact, when we do these prescribed fires, we have to rake around trees that we know have been drilled by woodpeckers. So there's a species of woodpecker that drills around the openings of their cavities, and it causes resin to drip down the bowl of the tree. And we have to rake around those so that they don't catch on fire, because it would be detrimental to the population of woodpeckers. But yeah, in terms of, I don't know if your question is about how that would contribute to any signal in the paleontological record, or just in terms of like actual accelerant of the fires themselves, or.
Well, I must admit that my bias towards all of this is I study a lot of insects preserved in amber,
Yeah.
and the formation of massive amber deposits. So in certain periods of time and in certain forest settings, particularly near deltas, we get massive, just unholy deposits of resin. And you can go through and you can see the deposition almost year by year in some of these unconsolidated lignite layers. And so one of the factors that has been suggested for some of these massive resin outpourings that then entrap a lot of insects and other organisms has been the role of frequent fires.
I see. Yeah.
And
boy, I'd be interested to read some of that material. Let's get in touch when this is over.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Brad has a question. I also want to let people know that if our time is expired and you need to leave, that's okay. But sure Matt can handle a few more questions too.
Yeah, I'm happy to stick around for as long as it takes.
Okay, Brad.
So thanks for the talk. I'm a retiree. So one of my things in being retired is trying to find last remaining orchids in the state.
Oh, okay.
And it seems like every time I find orchids, woodland orchids, they're always in a pretty high duff area.
Huh.
Have you noticed anything when you work there with fire? And you're in a lot better orchid habitat than we are.
Yeah, I do know that I don't know much about orchids per se, but I do know that a lot of the spring ephemeral enthusiasts are concerned that we're burning too often. So there are some rare endangered trillium species, for example, that people are concerned about. But in truth, it turns out that the intensity of fires that we're applying in those locations is low enough that they're unaffected or maybe favored. So we're not trying to consume. So that's the difference between a wildfire and a prescribed fire, right? Is that if we do a prescribed fire, we can choose a day that is wet enough or high humidity enough or cool enough temperature wise in the atmosphere or whatever, that we're not going to consume the entire duff layer.
Actually,
it would never be our intent to do that.
Yeah, I'm actually more worried about the worms than I am fire.
Yeah, as you should be.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so in Kansas, these jumping worms, we have collected them in Kansas. So I would be, kind of interested to know if you're seeing anything like that in those. So these are, I gather, in like riparian gallery type forests, or?
Well, they're in our best forest that we have, and
okay.
There's no doubt about that that's left. I mean,
yeah.
And they are almost always on some kind of slope going down to a creek, but not in the creek.
Yeah, interesting. Well, so I mean, it's I would say that I've completed the middle 10 years of my career now. And I think the last 10 years of my career, I'm going to really focus on sort of the biogeochemical and biological underpinnings of the process of duff formation, because it's so important ecologically. It's so important in terms of fire propagation and fire behavior and fire effects. I think it's more than there'll be more than enough for me to chew on for the next 10 years or so. And maybe I'll make my way to Kansas, who knows?
Mac, is there any evidence that the earthworms and how they alter or incorporate that duff layer into the mineral soil, do they affect fire return intervals, or is it just so heavily human managed now that that doesn't matter?
Well,
Or it might not matter.
it turns out that I have a conceptual model of that. We don't have any we don't have any data yet. So that's another thing that's going to be kind of a major thrust of Melanie Taylor's dissertation work. So she's trying to design the critical experiment that will address that very question. And so in our concept, right, we think that the activity of the earthworms is actually hastening the process of misification, right? So we know that as that fuel gets consumed not by fires but by worms, right, then the other positive fire effects are no longer possible. And so the fire intolerant species are naturally or necessarily favored by the activity of the worms. But it's kind of a chicken or the egg question. I mean, this really gets to the crux of what Melanie's talking about in her dissertation. So these earthworms, we also know, so there's a whole lot more to say about the earthworms and their feeding habits. And, you know, their kind of their preferential food source. And so they like the stuff that's labile, obviously, right? They have to spend less energy metabolically to process it. So, you know, they really like tulip poplar and sugar maple leaf litter. And at the same time, they promote the fire intolerant life strategy of those species, right? So are they kind of moving, is misification proceeding simultaneously for those two groups of organisms, or do the earthworms facilitate, or do the trees facilitate the earthworm invasion, or what? You know, we're still collecting data to answer that question. But yeah, I mean, you're getting right to the heart of it with that question.
Helen?
Just a general knowledge question. I assume that other than trying to keep the worms from getting into new areas, is there any way to control them? You kind of hinted at the fire effects, but is it kind of, are we doomed, or is there any way to?
Yeah, you know, that's an interesting question. And I have found it best to try not to predict the future.
Yeah.
Because I am sure that there is some kind of a viral epidemic that's just waiting to take hold of the invasive earthworms.
Yeah.
And they'll no longer be a problem, right? So yeah, so the answer is that in the big position paper that Chihan Chang led and that I alluded to in the talk, which was in biological invasions, there's a whole section where we talk about potential avenues for control. And so I think the best answer to your question is that if we know of places where they aren't, we should keep them out of there. And if we know of specific places where they are that we definitely don't want them, we should treat those areas with, you know, extreme prejudice, or whatever you want to call it. Like, do what we can. And there are some tools that we can bring to bear in addition to fire. You know, there's some chemical treatments that can be used and things like that. So yeah, I mean, the group has been thinking about ways of developing control measures for sure.
Thank you.
All right, that was a lot of questions. Your talks always result in a lot of questions.
That's mainly because of all the confusion. I inspire confusion everywhere I go.
Interesting and thought-provoking, and I am challenging my students to come up with conceptual frameworks for their research questions and objectives. So your style is carrying on, and it's good.